I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
We're talking today with Alan Vande Vusse of North Muskegon, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Alan, can you start us off with some background on yourself? To begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born and raised in Holland, Michigan. Lived there most of my young life. Graduated from Holland High School in 1962. Typical middle-class Dutch family. My dad was a butcher, the A&P store.
All right. Now, what did you do after you finished high school?
I got a job for municipal foresters. We did power line clearance. I did that up until the time I went in the Marine Corps. I got married in 1963. We had twin daughters. We ended up getting divorced in 1968. We were just too young to get married, but you find that out later on in life.
All right. Now, what motivated you to enlist?
Well, the motivation was once my divorce was final, I was changed from 3A back to 1A. I was close to 24 years old, and all of a sudden I got my draft notice to go into the Army. My dad was a World War II and Korean War veteran who was a United States Navy Fleet Marine Force corpsman who served with the Marines in World War II and Korea. At that time, in '68, there were 18 people from Holland that ended up getting killed in Vietnam. And in '67, '68, there was a lot of people getting drafted in the Army, going to boot camp, going to advanced infantry training, going to Vietnam, and coming home in a box inside of less than a year. They weren't getting enough training. My dad, with his history with the Marines, said, son, if you want to keep your act together, you join the Marines instead of getting drafted into the Army. And he was right, as most fathers are.
All right. Now, so you were paying at least some attention to what was going on with Vietnam, because your friends were going off.
Yes, in fact, my very best high school friend, Gordy Idema from Holland, was killed on January 18th, 1968, just before Tet, a couple weeks before Tet of '68. He was in the Green Beret, and he was awarded, I shouldn't say awarded, he received the Medal of Honor posthumously.
Thought that name was familiar. All right. Okay, so when do you actually then report for duty?
I ended up, they had like a 90-day delayed enlistment program at the time. I ended up going in the very beginning of February of 1969.
All right.
I got married for the second time 2 weeks before that.
Okay. Now, what did your new wife think of the prospect if you're going off to the Marines?
Well, but when we got married, she knew I was going to have to do that. So that's called life.
All right. Now, take me kind of through the process. Now, did you have to do a physical before you went, or had you done that earlier?
Well, you end up going to Detroit, AFES they call it, and you get your physical, this, that, and everything else. You take tests for your intelligence level and everything. And,
so they were doing that testing in Detroit rather than out at, did you go to San Diego for base?
Yes, I went to San Diego. Most people from Michigan go to San Diego for boot camp if you go in the Marines.
Right. Okay. Now, when you were doing the physical, were you doing this just with other enlistees, or were there draftees there too, or do you not know?
There were draftees and enlistees there.
Okay. And were any of the draftees trying to do things to get themselves out of it?
Typically, yes. Imagining all sorts of problems. I have a friend back home in Holland that every year for his physical, he didn't smoke, but he'd roll his own cigarettes with crushed up aspirin in them, and he'd go to Grand Rapids at the time for a physical, or maybe it was Detroit, I'm not positive, but he'd have high blood pressure. Well, he never went. I had other friends that stayed in college for 6 or 7 years rather than typical 4, so they could keep their deferment.
Yeah, that didn't always work.
No, it didn't.
depended. Draft boards were often kind of careful about those 4 years, but all right. So now, but when you were actually at the induction center, did you notice people trying to scam in some way, or did you just learn about that from other places?
I learned about that other places, like even during boot camp, we had guys that would claim all sorts of problems. All of a sudden, they were never religious. All of a sudden, I'm a Baha'i. I don't believe in war, and I want to be a conscientious objector. Other people, in fact, I had to stand guard duty in boot camp a couple nights. We had these guys that would, turns out later, intentionally urinate themselves. So we'd get them up every hour on the hour to make them go to the bathroom. But there was all sorts of things.
All right. Now, how did they get you out to San Diego?
Just flew out there.
So you just flew by yourself on a commercial plane?
There were 5 of us, because I was in the delayed entry program. I got put in charge of the records for the 5 people. Got to the airport. All of a sudden, there was this Marine sergeant there with a Smokey the Bear hat on. And said, "All right, you guys, on the bus." And nothing out of the ordinary.
So he wasn't shouting at you in the airport or anything like that?
No, not until we got to MCRD San Diego. Then he gave us about 30 seconds to get off the bus, and then they had all these yellow footprints on a 45-degree angle. All of a sudden we're standing on the yellow footprints, and that's when we probably all said, "What did we get ourselves into?"
All right. How much of that were you expecting?
My father told me, even though he was in the Navy, he served with the Marines. He says they're going to be tough on you. But I was in really good physical shape from those 5 years of cutting trees down and everything. So I was 6'1", 155 pounds, dripping wet. But I did well physically in boot camp.
Now, were you older than most of the guys you were training with?
Yes, I was nearly 24, and everybody else was 17 or 18. I was the old man of our platoon.
Okay. The 17-year-olds would have all been volunteers, because you don't draft at 17.
No, they were volunteers. We had a combination in our platoon.
All right. Now, when you got there, did the regular regime start right away, or did you go through preliminaries of some kind first?
It was, we were like a herd of sheep, you know. What they do is they take what they called civilian pukes and brainwashed us, basically, and there's 3 different ways of doing things: the right way, the wrong way, and the Marine Corps way. And the Marine Corps way is always right, and we learned that very fast.
Right.
There was some abuse in boot camp, physical abuse, but it made us tougher people. They had a sign above the gate at boot camp that said, "The more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war." And that's true. And that's one thing. I will be very proud to the day I die that I was a United States Marine. There's no such thing as an ex-Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine.
I've been told that.
And other branches of service, and each one has their own job to do, so they're trained differently. Marine Corps is more like shock troops. We weren't in our best situation in Vietnam because the Marines are typically not trained for long-term warfare. That's the Army's job. We were trained as the shock troops to go ashore, take a beachhead, and then the Army would come in.
All right. Now, what did the actual boot camp training consist of?
Well, we'd get up 5 in the morning and go to bed at 9 o'clock at night, and it was just discipline, a lot of physical training. After we were there probably 2-3 weeks, we were running 3 miles a day in the platoon formation. And by the end of boot camp, we were running 3 miles 2 or 3 times a day. A couple times 6 miles. We'd get to the end of 3 miles, say, we're done, and the DI would keep on going. And nobody wanted to be the one that fell out.
Right.
We went out of that time, we spent 2 weeks in Camp Pendleton for the rifle range, a place called Edson Range. And the one thing the Marine Corps really believes in is marksmanship. And everybody is trained as an infantryman in the Marine Corps, whether you're going to be a flute player in the Marine Corps band, or what we call a Remington Raider, clerk typist, radio operator, like I ended up being. Everybody's basically trained as a rifleman because the Marine Corps is the smallest branch of the military.
Now, were they training you on M14s or M16s?
We started, in boot camp, it was M14s. I never saw an M16 until I got to Vietnam. And the M14 is a much more accurate weapon, especially at long range, but they found out in Vietnam everything was close range, and they wanted the firepower rather than the knockdown power. M14 would put you down to stay there, a 16 would hurt you, but they're a boat-tailed bullet, so when they hit, they tumble. And you know, could come in here and come out down here someplace. You never know.
All right. Now, what kinds of people were training you? What kind of background do the DIs have, as far as you can tell?
All three of our drill instructors were all Vietnam veterans. One of them was an infantryman, one was a air wing person, and one was a clerk typist. You never know, but they were all Vietnam veterans.
Now, did they tell you anything about Vietnam, or just that this is serious business?
If you don't do it our way, you're going to go there and die. They teach you, they almost make robots out of you. You respond instantly to commands. The purpose of the haircuts, where they shave off your hair, all your hair when you first get to boot camp, is one, for health reasons, second, to degrade you. They took 83 young American boys from every walk of life, from the lowest part of society up to a couple of college graduates, and you're all equal. And you're not a person anymore, you're part of a team.
Right.
Marine Corps is famous for that, and they do an awesome job of it.
Now, what was the ethnic mix of the people in boot camp?
I would say there was probably, it was 90% Caucasian, and we had a half a dozen blacks, maybe a half a dozen Hispanics, and one American Indian.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not too far off from the demographics of the country, or even a little bit whiter than average at that point.
Yeah.
All right. Now, were the DIs all white, or were some of them black, or?
Excuse me?
Were the DIs all white at that point, or?
Yes, all three of them were white.
Okay. Now, how long did the boot camp go?
Ours, they reduced it during Vietnam. At one time it was 12 weeks, but they reduced it down to, I believe it was 10 weeks, including the 2 weeks on the rifle range.
And then when you completed were the 2 weeks in the rifle range the last thing you did, or are they stuck in the middle somewhere?
No, we went to the rifle range like 2/3 the way through, then we came back for 2 more weeks, primarily getting ready for graduation and final inspection and stuff like that.
Okay. Now, you get to the end of that. Now, by this time, do you know what you're doing next?
Just before the graduation ceremony, the senior DI comes out with a list, and he goes through it alphabetically. He says, "You're going to be an 0300 infantry. You're going to be this. You're going to be that." They got to my name. They said 2500 radio communications. We had our graduation ceremony. There was a guy from Holland that was stationed in San Diego. He came to my graduation. He was an older brother of a friend of mine. We had 4 hours of base liberty, and then they packed us up on a bus and right up to Camp Pendleton for 30 days of what we called ITR, Infantry Training Regiment. It's the same thing as advanced infantry training in the Army.
All right. So you're radio communications, but you still get at least those 4 weeks of that.
Everybody got the 4 weeks of ITR.
Okay. Now, if they were going to be combat infantry, would they then stay longer?
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Then they'd go on to specialize, whether they were going to be a rifleman or a machine gunner or mortarman or whatever.
All right. Now, when you enlisted, had you been able to put down any preferences for what kind of work to do?
No, at that time there was only 2 choices, and that was ground or air. I could have put in for air, didn't know any better about it, but because of my test scores, if on the general military subjects test that everybody for every branch of service takes, if you're above a 120, that's the highest classification. That's where I was at. So then you end up in a more technical field. The people that didn't score quite as high, whether or not they figured that maybe they wouldn't pass an advanced school like electronics or this or that or whatever. It was just a way of doing business, I suppose.
Okay. Now, had you known your test score going in, or when did you learn
Yes,
that?
yeah. You take that test before you actually enlist.
Right. Because I guess off camera you'd mentioned that the test score has something to do with length of hitch that you signed up for.
Well, no, what it was I originally enlisted for 2 years. I was going to get drafted in the Army, so I went up to Grand Haven and enlisted in the Marines, and the recruiter walked right next door to the draft board at in the courthouse building and says, you can take his name off your list because he just enlisted in the Marines. And when I got to Detroit, the gunnery sergeant there that was in charge of the Marine section in Detroit, he says, you know, young man, he says, you got really good test scores. He says, if you go on for 2 years, you're probably going to go in the infantry. He says, if you enlist for 4, you'll get a good school. I can't guarantee you what it's going to be, but you'll get one. So he hooked me in, and I enlisted for 4 years, which ended up he got credit for signing somebody up for a longer period of time. And I ended up being a radio operator and finding out that earlier on in Vietnam, that was the first person they wanted to kill. That radio on your back was called a target, and that antenna sticking up in the air. Because the lieutenant in the Marine Corps is always the guy right ahead of you, and the Vietnamese knew that. They'd set off command detonated mines. Without a radio, you have nothing. No resupply, no air, no artillery, no naval gunfire, no medevacs, nothing.
Yeah. And that was how the Americans fought in Vietnam. They needed all of those advantages.
Yes. Well, I mean, just like, like in the Marines, you know, well, weren't you in the infantry? I said, no, I was a radio operator. In the Marines, typically only 1 out of 8 people is in the infantry. It takes 8 people in the background to support that infantryman. In the Army, it's an 11 to 1.
Yeah. All right. Now, you got the 4 weeks in ITR. What was that like for you?
Well, it was a lot of forced marches. They taught us about all the different heavy weapons and had us fire a lot of things from machine guns to mortars, and they'd give us demonstration fire of artillery. Had a guy a half-mile away at night light a cigarette just to show you about light discipline, and from a half-mile away on a clear night you could see somebody smoking a cigarette. And we had they had a jungle warfare section set up where they showed us different types of booby traps and this and that and everything else.
All right. Now, at this stage, were they telling you more specifically what to expect in Vietnam, or were they still just doing it more generally?
The same thing in Camp Pendleton. All the troop handlers were all Vietnam veterans, most of them infantry veterans. And we had a lot of different firing ranges and everything, and they taught us the point-shoot technique, which works. You don't physically aim, you point, and most times you're going to hit what you point at. It's just automatic reaction. The squad, the fire teams and everything, how to leapfrog each other. If you run into an ambush, which the Vietnamese would typically set up an L-shaped ambush, and our philosophy was to scream like a bunch of maniacs, put them on full automatic, and charge right through the ambush. And the VC and NBA think these guys are crazy. And, but it worked.
You got to watch hitting your cord there.
Yeah, I just realized that.
All right. Okay, so you get some kind of fairly practical training on that sort of thing. Now, you do that for 4 weeks, and then from there you go to radio school? Is that...
From there, we got to go home on leave for 10 days, and then I went back to San Diego for a 12-week-long radio school.
All right.
Where we learned how to operate all the different types of radios. I was in radio, telegraph, and telephone and telegraph, how to operate a switchboard. We learned Morse code. I never used it in Vietnam, but if all other means of communications fail, CW still works. So
what is CW?
Continuous wave.
Okay.
The old Morse code. Did he not? And we had to learn how to receive 40 words a minute and send 30 words a minute. So we had to learn how to type at least 40 words a
Yeah.
minute, because you can't write that fast.
All right. Now, were there people who couldn't do that would wash out of that? Or?
Yes. Yeah. I ended up, ironically, being the #1 graduate in our class, and we were supposed to be guaranteed promotion to Lance Corporal. And I had an aunt and uncle that lived in Long Beach, and the weekend before graduation from radio school, we had weekend liberty, and I went up there and spent the weekend with them. And unbeknownst to me, they had a fight in our squad bay, and it was a racially motivated fight. So basically, our class was blackballed. I didn't get my Lance Corporal. I got a little 2-cent gold lick-em, stick-em seal on my diploma saying I was the #1 graduate in my class. But I didn't get the promotion. And we all got orders for Vietnam, our whole class.
All right. Now, you said you had a racially motivated fight in the barracks. I mean, was there kind of just a tension running through there the whole time?
In the late, no, but in the late 60s, there was a lot of racial tension in every branch of the service, and some of this, after looking back at it over the years, was caused by our dear old Senator McCarthy and his Project 100,000, which a lot of people don't know about, but basically what they did is they lowered test scores so that people that normally would have failed the test passed it. What that actually did, it was politically motivated. What it did, it put 100,000 not too smart people in the military, and that's 100,000 people that were on the verge of bombing out in college didn't have to go.
Because in principle, part of the idea was that the testing system almost looked racist because you poor blacks with very bad education tended not to pass the intelligence tests and things like that.
That's
so
true.
the thought was, let's go help them and show that everybody's equal. But in the meantime,
But there's two sides to every story.
Yeah, but then what happens when you bring them in and who's making the decisions? Yeah.
And it took till the mid-70s to resolve that problem once Vietnam was over, and most of these people had problems, got in trouble all the time, and ended up getting bad conduct discharges and stuff like that, and took like till the mid-70s when I was on recruiting duty before that was resolved.
All right. But it wasn't normal to have fights break out in the barracks or
No.
things like that.
No, it just, and who knows why it started.
And you weren't there.
And I wasn't even there.
Right. Okay. So now your whole class initially gets orders for Vietnam. So what happens to you at that point?
Now I go back home on for 10 days leave again. In fact, it might have been longer than 10 days. And the day I had to leave to go to Camp Pendleton, the staging battalion, to go to Vietnam, my oldest daughter was born, and I had to put on a mask and a gown and everything. I got to hold her for about 5 minutes in Holland Hospital in Holland, Michigan. And then I had to go to Grand Rapids, jump on an airplane, and go to Camp Pendleton to go to staging battalion and go to Vietnam. And it turned out our whole radio class ended up there. And we got there on a Friday, and on Sunday they said, okay, you guys hop on this bus, you're going to 29 Palms, California, out in the middle of the Mojave Desert. So we got enough radio operators in Vietnam right now, which was hard to believe because, like I said, radio operators were called a target. But this was as Vietnam was winding down.
Right. Because a lot of Marine units were getting pulled out and they were
Right.
downsizing.
And the Army, everybody was downsizing at the time.
All right. So what's 29 Palms like?
It's the largest Marine Corps base. It's 947 square miles of desert. And there's bombing ranges from the Navy and Marine Corps planes from Naval Air Station Miramar down near San Diego would come out there and drop bombs, and artillery ranges. There was 3 artillery units out there and a communications unit. And it's just out in the middle of the desert. It's in fact, it's one of the largest Marine Corps bases. As I said, it is the largest, but it's got a lot more troops there now. Half the troops from Camp Pendleton are now in 29 Palms, and the base has grown exponentially, and because where have our last 2 wars been? In the desert.
Yeah. All right. Now, what did your duties consist of once you got there?
I was a radio operator with 9th Communications Battalion. for about 6 months, and we'd go out on maneuvers out in the desert, set up radio relay stations, this and that. And once a month, a couple of us would have to take a radio jeep and drive around out in the desert because dirt bikers and stuff like that, they didn't have a fence around 947 square miles. And people would come in there not realizing it, and they could be in an artillery or a bombing range.
Right.
So we'd go out to track down people like that and tell them to get out of there and whatever. And by that time, my wife and oldest daughter had moved out there, and we were living off base in a trailer court out in town. And once our daughter was about 3 months old, found out she had a defect. Her one hip didn't calcify. We had to go to Camp Pendleton. She got put in a brace from her waist all the way to her knees with like a broomstick in between it. And then we have to go to Camp Pendleton and get it changed once a month. And this chief warrant officer in 9th Com in my section realized that we were having problems with our daughter. And like I said, there was 33 of us from our radio class that got sent out there, and they were sending them to Vietnam one at a time. This is one time it paid off to be at the end of the alphabet. And they were about halfway through it, and he says, Lance Corporal VandeVusse, he says, the commanding general's orderly got transferred, and he needs a new one, and they always pick somebody from the comm battalion because you guys are supposedly smart and squared away. So he says, I'm going to send you up there so that I can erase your name off the board here. So I ended up for almost 6 months being the commanding general's orderly, and because of that, I went from Lance Corporal to Corporal. But finally, they got down to my name, even though it wasn't on the board anymore. They said specifically, we need a 2533 to go to Vietnam, so it ended up being me.
Okay. Now, what did you actually do as the general's orderly?
Basically, I'd, when he was aboard base, when he came up to the headquarters at 8 o'clock, just before 8 o'clock in the morning, I'd run his one-star flag up the flagpole, and I'd get him a glass of iced tea, and I would take his laundry to the base laundry to have it starched and pick it up. I was also his field driver. He had a staff sergeant who drove a staff car on the base, but when he'd go and like to observe some maneuvers and stuff like that, and then I'd drive when we went out in the desert. And just miscellaneous stuff, whatever he wanted, and I'd have to fill up his ink pen every morning, all sorts of weird things, bring him a glass of iced tea after he got back from lunch.
All right. Was he a decent enough guy to work for? Or?
He was an awesome gentleman. His name was Brigadier General Carl Hoffman. He ended up retiring as a Major General. He was a World War II veteran. Just a wonderful individual. His Sergeant Major was a tail gunner on a TBF torpedo bomber in the South Pacific in World War II. Just an awesome man.
All right. So now when do you get your orders for Vietnam?
Let me see. This was towards the end of 1970, maybe October or something like that. So then they gave me 30 days leave, packed my wife and daughter up, and back to Holland, Michigan with them, and then got out to Camp Pendleton, the staging battalion, went through that. That took a month.
What do they do in the staging battalion? You just wait?
Well, you get all your shots you need for overseas deployments. You fill out your will. You go through the jungle school again. All sorts of things about tactics in jungle warfare. And then all of a sudden they decided, and I was a corporal at the time, they needed 2 corporals to be in charge of a bunch of guys that were on mess duty for 30 days. So myself and another corporal got volunteered for that. So that was another month. And then before you know it, it was almost Christmas of 1970. And then I ended up going to Okinawa, where everybody stopped on their way to Vietnam. And you'd leave your regular clothes there and got your jungle utilities and everything. And then turned out that they'd forgotten to give me a shot in Camp Pendleton. I said, okay, give me the shot. So they gave me a shot. But you don't understand, you have to be quarantined for 10 days before you can go to Vietnam. So well, this breaks my heart. So I was there for an extra 10 days. So it was like January January of 71 before I ever got to Vietnam.
Okay. Now, were they flying you in military aircraft, or did you do civilian charters? Or?
We flew out of Travis Air Force Base in California to Okinawa, and that was on a civilian airliner. And at that time, we flew a civilian plane from Okinawa to Da Nang, Trans World Airlines. They had stewardesses and everything. They were like 50, 60 years old. But
or at least they seemed like it at the time.
yeah, well, compared to people 18 to 25, they were old.
All right. All right. What was your first impression of Vietnam when you got there?
Well, as we were on the approach, I noticed all these black spots on a runway, and I says, "What in the heck is that?" Turned out that's where rockets had hit, and they were patches in the runway. And one of the first things I remember is as soon as you got in the doorway to hop off that plane, it was like 110, 115 degrees. It's like the heat just slapped you in the face because the humidity was always between like 80 and 90% there too.
All right, so you're landing during the day then, so you can see this stuff,
Yes.
feel the heat and the rest. Okay.
And you see all the F-4 Phantoms on the runway, and there's some of the old, what do they call them? The gunships there. And you see these other guys walking to get on another plane, and they're saying, "You're gonna be sorry," you know, and we, didn't know what we're getting into. So then we end up going to this big barracks building, and we're in two lines, and they're assigning units to everybody. And we're all Marines, and we're in these two lines, and as people were getting up there, you can hear them say, "You're going to 1-5, you're going to 2-5, you're going to 1-1, you're going to 1-1, you're going to 2-5. Those are infantry units. They got to me and they said, "Corporal, radio operator." He says, "You sit over there. About a half hour, 6 by, I'll pick you up, and you're going to First Med." And I says, "First what?" I'd been in the Marine Corps almost 2 years, and I'd never heard of a medical battalion. Later on, I found out every Marine division has a medical battalion, which is about 75 or 80% Navy, and then there's a Marine Comm section, motor transport section to run the ambulance trucks and to repair them, and a supply section. And we'd have perimeter duty at night and do our jobs, regular jobs during the day.
Okay. So the Navy personnel are doctors, nurses, corpsmen. That's
Doctors and corpsmen. No, the nurses are all male nurses.
but there still are nurses. That's as a
Yes,
rank and
yes,
station.
yeah.
All right.
And some of the doctors were there voluntarily. We had one doctor that volunteered to go in the Navy, to go to Vietnam for a year, just for experience. And he did all the head wounds. But that was so he'd come back to the world, back to the United States. We called it the world.
Right. All right.
And it probably helped him tremendously later on back here in the United States.
Okay. Now, what kind of facility did you have for 1st Medical Battalion? How were you based or housed? Or
Well, we were about halfway between the Da Nang Air Force Base and the 1st Marine Division headquarters. The Freedom Hill PX was about a half a mile down the road from us. It was a typical compound. We had like 6 guard towers and barbed wire around the whole compound, bunkers, everything else. And then a PSP outer LZ, then a taxiway inner LZ with PSP set up like on a 30-degree angle and concrete inside of it to protect the helicopters when they got in there.
okay, so you had like revetments around.
Revetment,
the
yeah, I'd call them similar to a revetment. And then there was a hole through one side that led to the emergency room. On the other side is where the comm bunker was, where I was working at.
All right. What kind of reception do you get when you show up? The truck drops you off, then what happens?
Truck dropped me off. I went and saw I think he was a 2nd class sailor, and he says, "You're going to be in the comm section." He took me down to meet the sergeant that was in the charge of the comm section. Wonderful black guy that he just grinned from ear to ear when he saw me, because that was his ticket home. That's why I got sent there, to replace him.
Okay.
And I've got a picture of he and I with that great big famous Jimi Hendrix poster with his hair up like this from Woodstock, behind us. And like I said, he was grinning from ear to ear because he was leaving the next day. And now I was there.
All right. Now, did he show you what you were going to do, or left
He
that to
showed
someone
me
else?
where the combacker was, where our hooch was. We had these hardback hooches with screens on the side and tin roofs and sandbags on either side of the roof with a rope in between to hold the roof down during the monsoon season. And the next morning, I'll never forget that, because this Lance Corporal was showing me how, I knew how to operate the radios, but he was showing me the technique that they use there.
Right.
And the communications lingo was a little bit more straightforward, not like the school-trained radio technology. And showing me how to operate this one and how to operate that one, and how to work the switchboard, and how to call the emergency room. And while I was there, a dust-off called up about 5 minutes out, which they always did, and ironically, it was an Army helicopter, not a Marine helicopter, because and his call sign was dust-off 999er. I'll never forget that, and that's why I use that as my email address. And he called up, and the Lance Corporal answered it, and he says, I got three coming in. I got 2 MF multiple frag wounds, 1 gunshot wound to the head. And that was the end of the call. And then he says, okay, now you call the emergency room and tell them what you've got, and then the doctors and corpsmen will be ready as soon as the bird lands. Well, then about 2 minutes later, the helicopter called back up, and he says, change that gunshot wound to the head to a permanent routine. And I looked at Lance Corporal, and I says, what's a permanent routine? He says, that means the guy died. He says, now you got to call the motor pool and have them send a cracker box down, which is what we called the ambulance trucks. And they'll pick up the body bag. And then you could, even through the walls of the bunker, you could hear the helicopter coming in. So me being curious, being only my second day at Vietnam, I walked out there and watched the bird land, and the corpsman ran on, got 2 wounded guys off and brought them to the emergency room. And then 2 more people pulled off this dark green bag and laid it alongside the LZ. And then the helicopter took off. The ambulance truck hadn't gotten there yet. And I walked over and looked at that body bag, and I just shook my head. And from that day till the present, I had this feeling, why me? How did I get so lucky to be here in Da Nang in the rear with the gear? And people are coming in body bags. And that, I didn't realize that at the time, but that was a traumatic experience that I've still got in the back of my head. But thanks to the Veterans Administration, I'm able to deal with things like that now.
All right. Now, what does your routine become then, now that you're there? What's your official assignment? And what are you doing?
I'm in charge of the comm section, so I assign the radio operators. We had like 8 or 9 of us, so we do like 4 to 6 hour shifts, because somebody had to constantly be on it, because you never know when a medevac bird was coming in. I would assign them, and then because I was a corporal and there was only myself and there was a couple of sergeants in the supply and motor transport sections, and about every 3rd day I'd have sergeant of the guard at night and be in the guard hooch, and every hour on the hour I'd have to go around to the fighting holes and the bunkers and make sure that none of the perimeter security had fallen asleep. And
All right. Now, was your perimeter on the outside of it then? Is there an outer perimeter around it, or is it just the outside world after that?
no, it's we had wire around the whole compound, and then the main road that went from Da Nang Air Force Base up to past Freedom Hill and 1st Marine Division headquarters, then curved around and went back over to China Beach and everything to Force Logistics Command was there, and there was like a ridge line behind that. And once every couple weeks we'd have to go up on the ridge line and be on perimeter duty up there. Where there was like a whole ring of mountains that surrounded the Da Nang area.
But your base was kind of sandwiched in between others.
Yes, just to one side of us was an Army Sky Crane helicopter place. These great big humongous helicopters with the middle of it's gone.
Yeah.
They could pick up a Connex box or a tank or a 155 millimeter howitzer or whatever, and cart them out to a fire base or whatever. And just south of us, there was a South Vietnamese compound.
All right. Okay. Now, how much business did the hospital get? Were you getting how many medevacs coming in a day?
As I said, I was there late. I was there in 1971, so President Nixon was winding down the war, and troops were going back. But there were still casualties, mines, booby traps, sniper fire. So you never knew. It might go 2-3 days with nothing, and then all of a sudden, 2-3 birds coming in. One time a CH-53 came in, and that was where they had rescued a pilot that had broken some bones and everything after he ejected. I remember that coming in because the big helicopter can actually back up by tilting the rotors a little bit. For whatever reason, it wouldn't work right, and it was there for half a day before they got it out of there. But and because of the proximity of the revetments, because the 53s are a lot bigger bird than the typical Marine bird was either not so many Hueys, mostly the CH-46 Sea Knights, which is very similar to the Army Chinook, except they don't have the fat belly on either side, which is, anybody's been in Marines can distinguish the two. A lot of people don't know the difference between the two, but there is a difference. But they're both twin rotor.
Right, but the Army didn't use the CH-46.
No, they had the CH-47 Chinook. We had the CH-46 Sea Knight.
Right. Okay. Now, aside from, okay, you'd work your shifts or whatever with the radio, you do your occasional perimeter guard and that kind of thing. Did you have any other duties, or did you help out in other places?
Yeah, maybe a couple times a month we'd the base would send out what they call med caps, or sometimes a doctor, but typically 2 or 3 corpsmen and half a dozen Marines, including a radio operator, and sometimes some ARVNs, some South Vietnamese troops. We go out to different little villages around the Da Nang area, and the corpsmen would patch up little kids that had open wounds, and they'd give them shots and stuff like that, and we'd be out there as security. And that was one of the good things what we did while we were in Vietnam. You know, everybody knows My Lai, but they don't know about the good things. The Marine Corps was famous for that. In fact, the Marine commanding generals were always having arguments with General Westmoreland all the time about, you got to win hearts and minds. That was the Marine philosophy. And the Marine Corps knew that from the 20s and 30s in the banana republics, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua. If you win the people, you win the war. But that was not the Army philosophy. They wanted to treat it like it was a conventional war in Europe, which doesn't work with jungle warfare.
Right. Yeah, I think Westmoreland's out after '68, and they tried different things, but the Marines have been doing that all along.
They did that all along.
Yeah. Now, what impression did you have of the civilian population that you encountered, or what were these villages like?
Well, they were, I mean, we had some people that would come like 7 in the morning and have to leave at 5 in the afternoon that would do laundry. They worked in the mess hall, stuff like that. They're all very nice people. The one hooch girl we had was, and she wasn't Buddhist, she was Catholic. But she was just a wonderful young lady. And they're probably all deceased now, because when we left, and in '75, when the North Vietnamese actually took over South Vietnam, everybody that had anything to do with Americans either were killed or put in re-education camps. The typical communist ploy. But out in the villages too, they were happy to get shots and bring supplies out to them and everything else. But you had to understand the mind of the typical South Vietnamese peasant. A lot of them were relocated to larger villages and everything. They didn't want to do that. They just wanted to be left alone by their little rice paddy and live their life. And it's part of their religion, the Buddhist religion, their ancestor worship. With their little plot of ground, all their grandpas and grandmas and everybody was buried right there. Now they were forcibly relocated by the South Vietnamese government to safe zones. And like around the Da Nang area, it grew up just like a tar paper shack city, just like happens around any military base where people are trying to sell you drugs or their body or illegal alcohol or this or that or anything that happens around any military base, whether it's in a war zone or in Germany or wherever.
But here you'd have a lot of people who were essentially refugees without much other means of support, too.
Right.
So that, yeah, and that kind of gets me to another thing. I mean, one of the standard assumptions about Vietnam, especially when you're in the rear areas, and especially later on in the war, is that you have all kinds of issues with morale and discipline, drug use, racial incidents, prostitution, various kinds of just refusal to obey orders, officer fraggings, all of that kind of stuff. How much of that did you actually see or was going on around you?
I saw a little bit of that. In fact, 2 incidents I can never forget. I was walking Sergeant of the Guard one night, and I was walking past graves, the graves registration, where they'd prep bodies before they'd send them back home for funerals. And the staff sergeant in charge of graves saw me walking by. He says, "Hey, Corporal Van, you want a sandwich? Come on in." This is, I don't know, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And this guy was up, and he opened up one of the reefers, which is one of the only air-conditioned buildings there, and going to make me a bologna sandwich. Well, he had his ketchup and mustard and bologna in one of the reefers. But it takes a special kind of person to work in graves registration. You didn't have to be crazy, but it helped. That's the way I always looked at it. And no big deal to him. So we're sitting there eating a sandwich. And he says, "Hey, you got to see this." So he opens up another reefer, and there's a man laying there. Looks like he's sleeping. He's got a Van Dyke beard, just beautifully trimmed beard. Looked like he was laying there sleeping. He turned his head sideways, and the whole backside of his head was packed full of gauze. And what it was, well, he couldn't have been a field corpsman. He must have been one of the technicians. I guess he had a drug problem, and he stuck a 45 in his mouth and blew his brains out. And I'll never forget that. I can still see the guy laying there looking like he was just laying there sleeping, except he had a tag around his big toe. And strange. And then there was a couple months later, there was a day where it was during the daytime, and I was Sergeant of the Guard, and somebody come running up from the other end of the compound, and they said, Corporal Van. He said, "There's somebody out there firing up the area with a 16. And I'm the duty NCO, so I locked and loaded my 45 and run down that way and just start running around this corner of this hooch down near the officers club between there and the corner tower, and there's a young black Marine just firing up the whole area with an M16. And just as I ran around the edge of the building, about 3 feet above my head, a round impacted, and I ducked back behind it. I says, that's the closest I came to getting killed in Vietnam. Was guy. It turned out the guy was high on drugs. And I ducked behind there and got on my right knee and looked back around the corner of the hooch and just leveled my 45. I figured, well, I'm the duty NCO. I got to control this situation. He was like 30 feet from me. I was going to shoot him in the lower leg before he killed somebody, whether intentionally or by mistake. And about the time I went like this, somebody grabbed me by the shoulder. He says, "God, don't shoot him." And it was one of the doctors.
All right. So you were talking, basically you're in charge of the guard that night. You get called because there's somebody shooting up the place with an M16. So kind of pick up the story at that point.
Yeah, it was actually it was during the middle of the day, and somebody ran up and said, "Corporal Van, there's somebody shooting up the area down there with an M16." So I locked and loaded my 45 because I was the duty NCO. I'm in charge of security. Ran down there, ran around the corner of the hooch, which was my first mistake because about that same time a round impacted about 3 feet above my head on the side of the hooch. And I noticed there was a young black Marine out there firing up the whole area with an M16 on semi-automatic. And the clips hold 20, but we'd only put 18 in because of spring pressure. And I ducked back behind the corner of the hooch, got down on my knee, and reached out and aimed my .45. I figured, well, I'm going to shoot this guy in the leg before he kills somebody by mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And about the same time, somebody grabbed my right shoulder, and it turned out it was one of the doctors. He was in his scrubs. He says, God, don't shoot him.
Mm-hmm.
And about the same time, the private ran out of ammunition, and he was having problems getting the clip out of the M16. And the doctor charged right out there. He must have been a former football player, like a linebacker or something. He just tackled the guy. And they handcuffed the guy, took him away, and he was never seen again. So I assumed he was drugged up or something.
Yeah, well,
wanted to get out of Vietnam, whatever, he probably did.
Yeah, because this is the point in time when heroin is starting to get around on the bases, and that can make people act crazier than the marijuana would.
The lieutenant, Lieutenant Durham, who was my superior officer, when I was sergeant of the guard every second or third night, he'd come around about midnight, and he'd go around with me, checking the fighting holes and everything, and we'd go into the unused bunkers and check them out, scope them out with a flashlight, trying to catch people smoking pot or whatever.
Right.
That was one of his main claims to fame and everything. He wanted to bust everybody that was druggy. And I think it was more the sailors than the Marines. The Marines, just, there was very little. You see that in, Full Metal Jacket and stuff like this, typically back in the rear with the gear, and it was very easy to get drugs there. I never got into drugs in Vietnam, not once. But other guys showed me you could buy a pack of cigarettes for like 300 piastres, which was like 50 or 75 cents American. It looked like a regular pack of cigarettes, except they'd open up the bottom, take them out, leave the fillers on them, take the tobacco out and fill it back up with pot. It looked like regular cigarettes. And it was very cheap. In fact, that was probably part of the communist deal too. We'll make them all druggies and get them out of here. I don't know.
But it was certainly common enough. But walking around the base at night or whatever, could you smell it, or
no,
not in your area?
People would not, by the hooches that we lived in and everything, you never did. And like I said, every second or third night I was sergeant of the guard. And obviously you can smell it quite a ways away if the breeze is carrying it, but no.
All right. And within at least your unit, were there racial issues at all, or?
No, we didn't have any. Like I said, the corpsmen and the medical technicians, the X-ray technicians, and stuff like that were, I'd say, well, typically 90% white, maybe 10% black, and that was the average in Vietnam of everything. There's some studies that say there was a preponderance of minorities in the infantry, and that's been found out to be completely false. It was the average in the country was like, in the United States was like 12.5% black, and the average was 10.5% in combat units in Vietnam. So a lot of these things are made up by people.
Yeah,
there were racial tensions starting to get there. When we'd be standing in line in the mess hall, a lot of the blacks were starting to do the DAP thing and stuff like that, where they had all this hand knocking stuff. So then we'd imitate it and made up our own just to, Actually, the problems were worse after I got back from Vietnam in Camp Lejeune.
Yeah. All right. Now, you wind up only being there a limited amount of time.
About 4.5 months. It's crazy because, well, number one, in the end of May of 1971, the 1st Marine Division stood down and moved back to the States anyway. And those people that had less than 6 or 7 months in country were farmed out to one of the small units that were still there. I was there about 4.5 months, and our mama-san one day brought me, because I was in charge of our hooch being a corporal, she brought me a couple of these little Vietnamese, kind of like watermelons. And the corpsman always told us, don't eat that stuff, because they use a different kind of fertilizer than what we use in the United States. But being a dummy, I didn't pay attention. I ate both of them because they were so good. Well, I ended up with terrible bowel problems, and to the point where I was bleeding internally, parasites, whatever, I don't know. So it ended up, I ended up getting medevac to Okinawa because I had to have surgery. And after being in Okinawa for about 10 days, the Army doctor looked at my chart and he says, I don't know why they always send you Marines, why the sailors send you Marines here to an Army hospital. He says, where are you from? I says, Michigan. Before you know it, 2 days later, I was on a 141 to go to Japan, and then to Elmendorf in Alaska, and Glenview Naval Air Station near Chicago, and all of a sudden I was in Great Lakes Naval Hospital.
Right.
And by the time I got out of there, basically the vast majority of the Marines were not in Vietnam anymore, so I didn't have to go back.
Okay. Now, how long did you stay at Great Lakes?
I was there about 2.5 months. I had surgery, and then there was a recuperative period, and then my orders didn't come through, so I was with the Marine detachment there, the Marine barracks, and one of my duties was driving a brig truck out to O'Hare and picking up with a couple of picking up cross-country chasers and deserters to bring them back to Great Lakes from the Midwest, and then they'd send them to either Camp Pendleton or Camp Lejeune for court-martials. So I did that for a while. Finally, my orders came through, and I went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina for a year.
All right.
With the 10th Marines Artillery.
And what were you doing with them?
Well, I figured, well, I'm going to get back into communications again. I'll be with the Battalion Fire Direction Center. I was there about 3 weeks, and they figured out, the Marine Corps in their infinite wisdom, radio telegraph teletype operator has to be able to type at least 40 words a minute, but an office clerk only has to learn how to type 30. So they figured, aha, this guy can type really well. So I ended up in the battery office, being the battery correspondence clerk for nearly a year, which was nice in a way because the duty rosters for people going on mess duty or being sergeant of the guard or whatever, I never got any of that because number one, our captain wanted me there, and number two, I made out the roster, so my name never got on the roster. So that was one of the benefits of working in a battery office, or it's like a company office.
Right. So did you kind of keep sort of regular business hours, or how did that
Yeah,
work?
it was just daytime duty, like 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, and then maybe every third weekend I'd have duty NCO in our barracks in case somebody reported in. And at the time, if you were below corporal, you still had to have a Liberty card, so you get weekend Liberty or whatever, or we check new people in or make sure people got back. Nobody was smoking in bed and trying to burn the place down, whatever. And that's where, in Camp Lejeune, the racial problems started getting worse. There was several guards, like armory guards and stuff like that got severely beaten. These are white guys that got beaten up by 3 or 4 black people. Even though they had a rifle, it wasn't loaded. You had a clip on your duty belt, but it wasn't in your weapon. But it was not a good thing. But later on in the 70s, most of that problem was resolved because a lot of those people ended up getting discharged and getting out of and it wasn't only in the Marine Corps, it was every branch of the service were having problems then.
Yeah. Now, did people use drugs on the base, as far as you know, or?
Yep, they did. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I'd say at least 50% of the drug usage was by minorities. Why? I don't know. Part of this, I think I alluded to the McCarthy thing with the 100,000. But by the mid-70s, most of those people were weaned, winnowed out.
Well, at this
military.
point, so you get over, you're doing this, so you kind of late 71 into 72, is that?
Yeah.
Right? So you still have people in there who were draftees?
Yes. Yep, still draftees, and that's, you get from the top to the bottom of society with the draft, which is good in a lot of ways, because I disagree with the system nowadays. I think there should, in my mind, there should be a draft or what I should say is national service, like the Scandinavian countries do. You get out of high school, you either go in the military or you work at a hospital or the Peace Corps or whatever for a year and a half, and then you go to college, and then you don't have your 20% freshman dropout rate in college, which you see nowadays. Because of immaturity and lack of preparation in high school.
Yeah, or people who just go there because that's
I don't
just
think
what you
it'll
do.
ever happen, not in my lifetime. I don't think it'll ever happen in the United States, but it would be one of the best things that ever could happen to our country. I firmly believe that.
Now, when you're out at Camp Lejeune, did you have your family with you, or?
No. It's North Carolina. There's a lot of people in the South that don't realize that the Civil War is over yet, south of the Mason-Dixon line, and that we Yankees from the North actually won that war, so we're the ones that got to write the history books. Let me put it this way. Down south, they liked the blacks better than they liked white people from north of the Mason-Dixon line. And this was in the 70s yet. Damn Yankees, you know. So anyway, my wife stayed back in Holland, Michigan while I was
and
there.
you lived on base?
And I lived on base. And at that time, there was not enough housing at Camp Lejeune. That was part of the reason too. But it was a good place for her not to be at. The base itself and its environment was fine to me, but like I said, you get out in town, on payday they liked your money, but the rest of the time they didn't like Yankees too well. They probably still don't to this day.
All right. Now, you had enlisted back in '69,
Yep.
and you had signed up for 4 years, so
Yep.
that runs out in '73.
Right.
What do you do at that point?
Well, actually I did it a year before that because I decided to re-enlist, but if on a 4-year enlistment, if you have 3 years and 1 day in, you can re-enlist. They drop the 4th year and then add 4, so that'll make a total of 7. So I re-enlisted, was given the rank of sergeant. I couldn't change MOSs because I was in an occupational specialty that was considered critical, so they wouldn't let me change. So they gave me a choice of duty station for a year. So I chose 29 Palms, California, out in the middle of the desert, because my wife and I loved it out there. So all of a sudden we're back in 29 Palms for a year, and we lived out in town at the same trailer court we lived in '69, '70. And I just loved it out there, because in the summertime you'd work from like 7 in the morning to noon, because it's so hot out there, although it was dry heat. But and then I'd been, same thing. Came back to haunt me being a good typist. I went back and figured, well, I'm going to 9th Comp, back playing with radios again, and I'm going to be in charge of a radio section now because I'm a sergeant. Report aboard. They look at my record book. I says, oh, you've got an 01 secondary, 0141, which means administrative clerk. And you're a good typist. Oh, and you're a sergeant, and you're going to end up in headquarters company, and you're going to work up on the hill. Same place where I was before, working for the general, only this time I'm in charge of Force Troop Central Files, where all the records of all the units and everything are, and all the manuals to look things up. I was in charge of that for a year. I've been there 10 months, and the captain at headquarters company, who disliked all the sergeants that worked on the hill because we never had to participate in company activities like field days and stuff like that, because our majors or colonels wouldn't, no, they're too busy. We can't let them down there. So he didn't think too highly of us sergeants up there. So he says, Sergeant VandeVusse, you report down to headquarters company down to my office. Walk in, he's got a great big grin on his face, and he says, I've got orders for you. He says, you're going to San Diego to go to drill instructor school. You're going to be a drill instructor. I says, but sir, I don't want to be a drill instructor. I says, I know what they did to me down there, and I'm apt to do the same thing, and I'll end up getting busted and thrown out of the Marine Corps. He says, well, you don't have any choice, you're going. I says, well, like I said, by this time I'd been in 3 years and I was a sergeant. I says, well, Captain, I beg to differ with you, but if you look a couple pages further back in my service record book, you'll see that you can't send me to San Diego. He goes, what do you mean? I says, flip back 3 or 4 pages. And that was my re-enlistment. And on a first re-enlistment, you were guaranteed a duty station for a minimum of 1 year. I'd only been there 10 months. Get out of here. Back up in the hill I went. About a month and a half later, I'd been there like 11 months and 2 weeks. Sergeant Vande Vusse, report down to headquarters company. He's got the same grin on his face. He's, you were going to San Diego to recruiter school. And you have to report there 2 days after my 1 year was up. So he met the letter of the law, and all of a sudden I was in San Diego for, it was either 10 or 12 weeks of recruiter school.
All right. Now, what did that consist of?
Almost like what we're doing here now. We had, number one, you had to be able to type at least 40 words a minute. You had 40 hours of typing, unless you, but I passed the test on the first day, so I had 40 free hours over a 6-week period. We had a lot of classes on history and traditions of the Marine Corps, because a lot of times when you're on recruiting duty, you get asked by the Rotary Club or this or that to come and talk. And we had a 5 and a 10-minute canned speech that we learned, along with flip charts. One of them about the American flag and one of them about Americanism. And they videotaped us because some of the people didn't want to be recruiters. There were a couple gunnery sergeants and a master sergeant there that were from the old breed of Marines yet that probably had an 8th grade education and were just standing there stiff as a board rather than acting natural. And I distinctly remember this master sergeant, them getting on him about, now you've got to use your hand movements to talk and everything. So he'd stand there at perfect attention, and every few words he'd go, he goes, or like this, or like this, rather than talking about something. And like I said, they'd videotape us, and then they'd show it back to the whole class, and the whole class would critique us on how we did or didn't do. And then we had some professionals come in from the phone company and teach us how to make phone calls, cold phone calls, and inside of 2 minutes try to get a young man to come down and visit us at our office to talk about possibly going in the Marine Corps. And all the little tricks of finding a former Marine at the high school and getting a copy of the senior class list with name, address, and phone number. Those were like gold to us. And some schools would voluntarily give them to you, and some schools, no way, Jose. I had one Catholic high school in Buffalo that the priest would let me in. He says, yeah, we had a guy who went in the Marines about 3 years ago, but naturally he went to officer school. It was one of the Catholic prep high schools. But other ones we did very well on.
All right. Now this is like late 73 now? We're talking,
yeah, 73. I ended up going to Buffalo, New York. I worked out of the recruiting substations in Niagara Falls, North Tonawanda, downtown Buffalo, West Seneca, and Amherst. I ended up being in charge of the recruiting station in Amherst, New York. I spent 46 months on recruiting duty, and I did extremely well at it. And I guess I got the natural gift to gab, and we had some recruiters that were just trying to get their body count, put people in. My quota was 5 people a month, and for 42 of the 46 months I made that, including getting recruiter of the quarter several times. And my premise was, don't lie to them. Tell them the truth. Tell them what can be guaranteed, what can't. Because I found out that just like in sales, your best recruiting or sales tool is a satisfied customer. It's just like selling cars. It's your repeat business. You send one guy in, he goes to boot camp, he gets the goods, goes to the electronics school, comes home on leave for 30 days and you can keep them there an extra 30 days assisting you. You take them out to the high school. See what Joe did? You can do the same. And it works. There's always those that wanted to be Marines. You always have those walk in. But the Army and the Marine Corps, especially right after Vietnam, had a very difficult time attaining their quotas. Nobody wanted to hear about it. People would join the Navy to wear the Dixie Cup and see the world, or join the Air Force because everybody's going to be a pilot, right? And somebody has to blow up the air on the tires. You know? And the Navy's not always as glamorous as what it appears to be, especially sea duty. If you got a sea duty MLS, you're out at sea all the time. So.
Yeah. Now, this is a period you've had a very active anti-war movement, all this kind of thing. Did you have run-ins or problems with that as a recruiter, especially, say, 74 around in there?
Well, number one, when I first got back from Vietnam, there was a lot of instances, especially on the West Coast, where the hippie movement started, obviously, of people getting spit on, this, that, and everything else, called baby killers and everything.
The protesters at the airports, they mostly came through, yeah.
I came back and went right straight to a military base. Great Lakes Naval Hospital.
Yep.
I didn't experience that. And I stayed in the Marine Corps rather than getting out like a lot of these people were going to get out a few days later.
Yeah.
They're the ones that experienced a lot of that. We ran into it at some of the high schools. Some of the principals and the school counselors and everything were adamantly against anything to do with the military. Although because of being public schools, most of them were forced to let us in there like once a month, whatever. But they'd hide us in a corner someplace or whatever. But and we had other ones where there were former Marines. Like this one high school, it was an A&P high school in Buffalo. Being a large city, they had a couple high schools that were just airframe and power plant. And they were training people to be airplane mechanics and everything at the Buffalo airport or whatever airport. And one of their teachers was a former Marine who was with the Air Wing, or as we called wing wipers or Airedales. But because of him, I got the high school list. Because of him, I'd go right to his class, and I think I enlisted probably 6 people out of his seniors. Because between he and I, we got him convinced, and these were all guys that had very good test scores, and we could guarantee him the Air Wing. And the only thing that would take their guarantee away is if they couldn't do the physical stuff and couldn't pass boot camp, or it turned out they were colorblind or something like that. Because to read wiring diagrams and wires, you can't be colorblind, obviously.
All right. Now, was there kind of a standard profile for who might sign up to join the Marines at this time, or were they just from all over the place?
That's very funny because I believe it was Cardinal O'Hara High School in Lackawanna, New York. I signed up as a senior in the delayed entry program, a young man who was all Western New York fullback for the Catholic League football teams. Because of him, I had 9 other guys signed up from that high school. And one of them, I mean, this fullback was just like a muscle builder. I had one guy that, when I took him down for his physical to the AFIS in the Federal Building in Buffalo, I had to feed him like 5 pounds of bananas in order for him to make the weight. He made the weight by 1 pound. He was so skinny. They all went off to boot camp together. I'm thinking, this skinny little kid's not going to make it. About 4 weeks later, I'm sitting in my recruiting office, and in walks the fullback. I said, "What are you doing here?" He says, "They threw me out." I said, "What do you mean they threw me out?" "Well, they yelled at me, and I got hit a couple times." And he broke down and cried. And 5 weeks later, I'm sitting in my recruiting office, and in walks the little 150-pound Marine wearing dress blues and only one person in each platoon got dress blues at the time, the platoon honor man.
Right.
He ended up being the best out of 80-some people. So you never know. You never know. Sometimes the mighty fall easily, and the young and skinny little guys turn out to be the best ones of the bunch.
All right.
And that gives you a source of pride. And then it's people like that you take back to the high school, and you get more recruits.
Yep.
And by not lying to them, that's the key point. And so many recruiters were only worried about their numbers. Nowadays, and we had to have 75% had to be high school graduates after Vietnam, which was a good thing. If you weren't a high school graduate, you had to get a higher test score, which the odds of that were slim to none. Nowadays, it's like 98%.
Well, even in
High school
Vietnam, there was a
graduates.
higher ratio of high school grads than you'd had in World War II or Korea,
Oh,
for
right,
that matter,
yeah.
just because of the way the education system changed. All right. Now, you did this for basically about 4 years.
Yeah, almost 4 years.
So that really takes you, so you had been initially enlisted for 4, but then that was shortened to 3. You added 4. Did you extend for a year?
Well, that's the other thing I forgot to mention about recruiter school. The day you got out of recruiter school, you had to have a minimum of 36 months left in the Marine Corps. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent you to that lengthy school. So I had to extend my enlistment for like a year and 2 months or something like that. I ended up with like 8 years and 3 months in the Marine Corps totally. And I seriously considered staying in the Marine Corps. I made staff sergeant on recruiting duty. If you're on recruiting duty or a drill instructor in the Marine Corps, they're considered the 2 toughest duties in the Marines. Because of that, as soon as you meet the minimum time and grade, which is typically 2 years between ranks, although it typically takes you 4 years between the higher ranks, the staff NCO ranks, you automatically go to the top of the list. So if I would have re-enlisted again at 9 years, I would have made gunnery sergeant E7, which would have left me 11 years to make my other 2 stripes or warrant officer. But I was having problems on recruiting duty, like 2/3 of us were. We were all Vietnam veterans. And recruiting right after Vietnam was tough.
Yep.
We were working 6 days a week, 10, 12, 14-hour days to make our quota.
And that's to get 5 guys in a month.
5 guys in a month. Because, like I said, there was a lot of anti-war sentiment in the country. Probably deservedly so after Vietnam. But it was tough, tough, tough. And a lot of us didn't realize at the time we had problems in the back of our heads from Vietnam. Recruiting duty was tough, but we were tough Marines. So what was our solution? Go downtown to the local bar after we got off of work. And we ended up drinking 3-4 nights a week, which was no good for anybody. No good for marriages, anything. I think if I would have re-enlisted, I probably would not still be married. So it was a combination of the hard times of recruiting duty, how difficult it was, the long days, and the drinking habits that went with it. I think my wife was about ready to divorce me. I says, I'm out of here. I'm not going to do it. Because the deal was, you're darned if you do and darned if you don't. You do good on recruiting duty, you stay on recruiting duty. The Army had just made primary MOS recruiters. The Marine Corps was talking about doing the same thing. So the last thing I wanted was another 4 years of recruiting duty.
Right.
Send me back to a base, let me be in charge of a radio section. Because by then I was a radio chief, so I would have been in charge of a whole comm section at a base. Nope, you're going to stay on recruiting duty. So I said, that's enough, I'm out.
All right.
But I didn't waste my 8 years because I ended up working for the post office for 31 years. And you could buy your military time just by paying in your retirement percentage that you normally pay at the post office. So I retired with a 39-year federal government retirement. So.
All right. Now, can you talk a little bit about sorting out kind of your own issues after Vietnam? And once you got out of the Marines, you didn't really talk to people about Vietnam or any of that?
For a long time, I didn't talk about Vietnam. Although my grandmother's house was right at the bottom of Cemetery Hill in Holland, and as a little kid, I used to sit in the tree in her front yard and watch the Memorial Day parade. Holland, Michigan is probably one of the most patriotic cities in the whole United States. I would say there's at least 5,000, if not more, people show up for the Memorial Day parade every year in Holland, to this day. Vietnam veterans were ostracized, even at a lot of VFW and American Legion clubs. Oh, that wasn't a real war you were in. You guys can't join here. I didn't have that happen, but I have some very good friends that did have that happen to. So for quite a few years, a lot of Vietnam veterans didn't participate in anything. Finally, one year I put on my jungle utilities, I'm leaning against the tree, and all of a sudden, the Vietnam vets started a chapter in Holland 30 years ago, and they had a little banner that said VVA 73 Holland, Michigan. There was like 6 of them carrying this banner, walking in the parade behind the World War II veterans. And this one guy noticed me standing by a tree, turned around, looked at me, and waved his hand like, "Come on, get in the parade with us." And I didn't. I just stood there. And then after the parade was over, I walked up the hill and watched the ceremonies. And while they were playing taps and firing the 3-gun volley and everything, and had tears in my eyes, reminiscing about my very good friend who I mentioned before, Gordy Idema, who was killed in Vietnam. And a Sentinel photographer caught that with a tear running down my cheek, and it was in the front page of the paper the next day. I still got a copy of that at home. But then I cut trees down for a couple years again, and then I ended up being a bartender and bar manager at the Elks Club in Holland. And I finally got the opportunity to get in the post office, and that was the smartest move I made in my life. And then I finally got involved in the Vietnam veterans in Holland, and they've got some little groups, little roundtable discussions where people could start to talk about their problems, and I got involved with VFW. I ended up being a commander of the Holland VFW post twice, in '93 and '94. And all the time I was at the post office, I still had the habit of going out once or twice a week, getting drunk, every time I had a little problem, and not realizing that the problems were in the back of my head from Vietnam. What a lot of people call survivor's guilt. I tried to always keep them out of my head, because I needed that good job at the post office for my wife and to raise our kids properly, be able to send them to college, which that was one of the happiest days of my life, seeing my youngest daughter graduate from college. I had the brains to do it, but never got there. I got myself to Vietnam instead, because of getting married right after high school. And like I said, the problems continued, but I always tried to hide them, because my last 17 years in the post office, I was in management in Muskegon. And that's the last thing they want to hear about. You got problems in your head, especially if you're in management. So I've been retired a little over 4 years now, and about 2 years after I retired, I started having nightmares again. And my wife finally said, "Al, I think you need to go down to Battle Creek and see the shrink." And I didn't. And then I talked to some people in Muskegon who were up from Holland with the Michigan Vietnam Veterans Wall. And one of the guys there said to me, "Al, you need to go see the shrink." Now I've heard it from 2 people. So I finally did. And after the guy got done with me, he says, "This is our little shrink's Bible here." And he says, the United States government says there's 7 reasons, valid reasons, to be classified as having PTSD. And I never thought I had this. I just wanted to see him so I could see a psychologist and talk out my problems. Says, "Well, I've got good news and bad news for you." I says, "Well, give me the bad news first." He says, "Well, there's 7 reasons, and you've got 5 of them." He says, "But the good news is, I can send you to see a psychologist, and he will help you." And fortunately, there was a psychologist from Grand Rapids that goes to Muskegon twice a week. And for like 4 months, I saw him one-on-one, once a week for an hour. And he didn't cure any of my problems, but he helped me solve them myself. And he helped me solve at least 75%, if not more, of my problems. I've given up on 90% of my drinking, which I found out was the #1 thing on the pyramid. What do veterans do? The tough old guys, they go out and get drunk. No, they're trying to drown their dreams. They will never go away out of the back of your head. You just learn how to break that triangle and try to think of a happy thought.
Right.
My best friend who got killed in Vietnam, every time Memorial Day come around, or a certain movie, certain old rock and roll song we used to listen to, I'd be crying like a baby. My wife says, "You got to forget that stuff." I says, "I'd love to, dear, but it won't come out of there.
Oh.
It won't come out." But
So now you
I've
live
learned how to think happy thoughts now. After about 2 months of seeing the psychologist, he says, "Al," he says, "I've helped you a little bit." But he says, "I know you were brought up in Holland, Michigan, religiously, like most people from Holland were." And he says, "There's not much more I can do to help you." And he says, "You know, I work for the United States government, so I can't tell you this legally." And he says, "I'll swear on a stack of Bibles I never did tell you this." But he says, "You need help from somebody else." And I think, if you think about it, you know who that person is. He says, "You got a Bible at home?" I says, "Well, of course I've got a Bible at home." I says, "I just haven't gone to church in years." Because it's hard to equate things I saw and heard about and death and destruction in Vietnam with religion. They just don't go hand in hand. He says, "Well, you go home and you open up to the 6th chapter of Ephesians and read the 10th through the 17th verses and see what it says." And it starts out talking about putting on the full armor of God. And I have since done that. And I feel so much better about myself now and my family. And it's amazing. We all get along so much better now, too. My youngest daughter, who, when she was a teenager, we used to fight tooth and nail because we're both stubborn. We're too much like each other. Day after Mother's Day, she was at her house, and she kissed me goodbye. I didn't kiss her, she kissed me goodbye. I told my wife afterwards how good that made me feel, because there was a long period of time where we just had too many problems, and it was because of the problems in the back of my head, and her being a little bit of a Stapelkopf Dutchman also, which means stiff-headed in English. And we go to church together, and my youngest daughter and I both go to the same church in Whitehall, and are fully involved in church, and I just feel so much better about my whole life now. And that's thanks to a VA psychologist. And the man up above that has helped me tremendously.
Yeah. Do you have any advice or suggestions for the guys who are coming back now from the Middle East, the ones who've been in Iraq or Afghanistan? What can they do to help them just get back into society?
Well, actually, the VA benefits are better now than what they were after Vietnam. I never went to college after Vietnam because all they did was pay tuition. I had a wife and 2 kids by that time. I just couldn't do it. Nowadays, they pay tuition, room, and board. Get yourself into a college, or at least a junior college or technical college, and learn a trade. Not everybody is going to be a scientist, but there's a whole generation of tradesmen missing. A CAD machine can't do everything. You still need your plumbers, your electricians, the electronics technicians, good welders, stuff like that, and they're good paying jobs. And also, take advantage of the VA health system. If you find yourself down in the dumps all the time, go to the Vietnam veterans. We've got Iraqi and Irani veterans that are members of our chapters. Once a week, they have, in Grand Rapids and Holland, they have little talk sessions to talk out your problems with people that went through the same thing you did. Go see them. See the VA if you need to. Talk to a psychologist. They will help. It'll help you immensely. You'll never forget those memories out of the back of your head, but you can learn how to deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you can ask the help of God too.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it makes for a pretty good story, so I'd just like to close out here by thanking you for coming and telling it to me today.
Well, it's taken me a couple years to do this. I've heard about this a couple years ago, and I've known other people from Holland that have done this, and I'm glad I came.
All right.
And I hope some of the things I told you about will be beneficial to some of our new veterans. And there's still Vietnam veterans out there that have big problems
certainly are.
and won't admit to it or don't realize there's help out there, and there is.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.